La Cabaña, El Presidio, El Paredón. These are names and places I will never forget. In the early 60s, they were Cuba's infamous political prisons that I remember visiting as a child. Several years ago, I took a video camera back to Cuba to tape what remained of La Cabaña and El Presidio Modelo. The footage you're about to see is unique. It was shot clandestinely over a period of several weeks. Even though today, the 17th century Spanish forts that were once Cuba's notorious prisons are tourist attractions, the actual cells and dungeons that house the prisoners are off limits to any visitor. Cuban authorities strictly forbid photographing the interiors. In fact, parts of the prison are still functioning military bases. And access is strictly forbidden. This is a personal story, a return to those dungeons and cells 40+ years later. My name is Rafael Lima, and this documentary is dedicated to Cuba's political prisoners, past and present. I am of that generation that was born in Cuba, left as a child, and was forced to reinvent himself as an American. As a child growing up, I lived in between cultures and languages, defined by what I was not. I arrived in the US too old to completely forget Cuba and too young to fully remember it. For me, and Cubans of my generation, Cuba has become a tangle of childhood memory and hearsay, an overlapping mix of imagination, old movie reels, and cuentos. Lost, somewhere at sea like Atlantis, Cuba exists for us as an island of the imagination where the sun always shines and perpetual breezes carry the smell of mojitos and rum. And for many of us, Cuba is also nightmare images of prisoners and firing squads, images which have replayed themselves continuously as a 4 decades-long silent movie. For me, and for many Cubans, those nightmare images have names that send shudders through our collective souls. La Cabaña, El Paredón, El Presidio. This is the story of a journey back to those places. This is the story of a collective nightmare. I am back in Cuba after a 42-minute plane ride. Driving along El Malecón in this antique car is perhaps the only proper way to be reintroduced to my dispossessed heritage. This Chevy doesn't just roll down the street. It floats down the Malecón like a riverboat. As we drive on El Malecón towards the old section of the city, I can see the hotels that line the harbor have withered to grotesque and gaudy hulks. 40 years of salt air have blurred the pinks, lime greens, and sky blues to chipped, weather-beaten pastels. Piles of bricks lie on sidewalks outside the crumbling walls. Mold grows over bare masonry. Moving past the window of the Chevy, open doorways yawn. Darkened stairway after darkened stairway lead to darkened rooms. Window after window that should have gleamed with glass are simply holes in the walls. Looking at this crumbling city now feels as though it wasn't the revolution at all that was responsible for this collapse. Looking at the remains of the columns and Baroque buildings, at the gilded architecture and ornate stylized excess, it seems as though on New Year's Eve 1959, the Havana of the 50s, fat and corrupt, repented for her sins and fell to her knees, not to God, but to Fidel. Havana began the process of obsessive self-denial so familiar to cults and communism. The smells of Bacardi and Cuban cigars drifted away with the Batistianos and the American mobsters that fled the island, and were replaced in time by the stench of cheap Russian gasoline, the groans of forced labor, replaced by the Cold War and the smell of the CIA burning cane fields. These exquisite colonial Spanish buildings are not crashing to the ground dramatically. If they collapsed in a huge crashing mass and were gone, that would be less painful than watching them slowly wash away, like sandcastles left behind by children at the beach. No, Havana's not collapsing. It's officially ignored and crumbling, brick by brick. Against the morning sun, I see the silhouette of a Russian submarine being towed out of Havana Harbor, a relic of the Soviets' prolonged military presence in Cuba. The black torpedo-shaped sub is flanked by battered tugs and moves past El Morro, where 400 years before, British man-of-wars, French frigates, and Spanish galleons clashed for control of the city and this island. Probably the sub, like much of Cuba's military arsenal, is no longer seaworthy, a dilapidated relic of the Cold War. Maybe the sub is being towed back across the Atlantic to the Black Sea, being moved to make room for the coming invasion fleet, gleaming American cruise ships, offloading battalions of tourists, armed with camcorders and American Express cards. The entire peninsula leading into Havana Harbor is taken up by two forts: El Morro, on which the famous lighthouse stands, and La Cabaña. It is telling that when I think of my father and my family, the first thing that should come to mind is this 18th century Spanish fort. Construction of the fortress Castillo de los Tres Reyes del Morro began in 1594. The immense rock fortress is perched at the very mouth of the harbor on a rocky point dominating any naval traffic entering the bay. Now, almost 400 years later, it stands over oil slicks and rusting freighters, facing the skeletal apparition of a crumbling Havana. It is impossible to speak of Cuba and not speak of prisons and prisoners. Some human rights groups have estimated that over 40 years, perhaps a third of the Cuban population have gone through Cuba's political prisons. In the early 60s, Cuba held the highest percentage of political prisoners in the Western Hemisphere, even higher than its overseer and role model, the Soviet Union. In 1953, the year that I was born, Fidel Castro and his rebel soldiers attacked a police barracks in the city of Santiago on the eastern end of Cuba called Moncada. That same year, 2 pilots were ordered by Batista to fly Fidel back to Havana for trial. Those 2 pilots were my father and my uncle, Luis Rojas. The 2 young pilots were ordered by Batista to fly the captured Fidel Castro back over the Cuban countryside to Havana. Fidel was handcuffed to the seat next to the open jump door, and my father tells me that he suggested to Luisito, my uncle, that they simply invert the plane, let Fidel drop out of the open door. But my uncle and my father both decided they could not. They were under orders to bring him back alive. Six years later, the captives would be my father and my 2 uncles. 6 years later, I remember coming back to this prison, holding my mother's hand. I get the feeling time has shifted back to when I was 7. This fort is not empty, but jammed with people waiting word of their loved ones behind those stone walls. I am not about to take a casual stroll through a tourist attraction, but about to grip my mother's hand and step into a kind of adult hell, unimaginable to a child. All I have as guide to get me through this immense stone fort are 40-year-old memories of prisoners in white t-shirts and khaki pants desperately holding women and other men with long black hair and ponytails and green uniforms. And guns. Everywhere guns. On either side of the procession were the milicianos with green uniforms and beards, carrying rifles as casually as tourists carry cameras. Once inside, I remember seeing men with large white P's stenciled on their backs, holding on to women in a way I had never seen before, their fingers pressed into each other's backs like it hurt, holding on as though they were on the edge of some cliff and one or another might slip out of each other's grasp. I remember it was the first time I saw grown men cry the way children cried.
Ya, ¿no? O ya se puede entrar. Está bien. Cualquier cosa, si tú no me dejas ir a la mata que me sacaron para allá afuera. Está bien.
Today the fort is a prison no longer, but rather a tourist attraction. There are even plans by the cash-starved Cuban government to develop it into a sprawling hotel. I'm trying to find the wall where the executions took place, El Paredón. I'm trying to find the dungeons of my memory. What I remember is that there is a figure of Christ at the beginning of the road, that the Christ seems to bless those who pass. I remember that the road curved, that it led down to 2 huge metal doors, portones, that the portones were rusty, and that behind the metal doors, men cried like children. But I can find no huge metal doors. Off one of the cobblestone paths, the facade of a scaled-down cathedral is cut into the side of the stone fortress. The cathedral has been reconstructed. The flagstone floors, laid by Negro slaves almost 400 years ago, look new. Through the glass can be seen a skull, partially exposed, the remains of an 18th century Spanish soldier. Below that, the vertebrae still aligned. A few ribs and the bones of the left hand, all partially still buried, as though someone had not finished completely exhuming the bodies. My father had once described how he was brought to this chapel to await his execution, but hours later had again been returned to his cell. Some prisoners were even led to El Paredón. There, firing squads would shoot over their heads. Then the men would be led back to Las Galeras to guess which day would be their last. It was psychological torture. I step past a chain-link fence. The open gate reads, "Prohibited Zone." As I look at the rows of barred windows, I realize I have found the prison. These are the dungeon-like cells of La Cabaña, the galeras, entapiadas, in which my two uncles and my father had endured their imprisonment. The place I had visited as a child. The cells themselves are darkened chambers cut into the coral rock. The limestone walls are constantly wet as though weeping. The humidity of the cells contributing to the disease and tuberculosis and deaths of many of the prisoners. My father had told me all of the executions had taken place within earshot of these galeras. My father had described how he and his fellow prisoners would hear a panel van pull up to the fort. The doors would open. Then the sounds of the jeep carrying the prisoner. And voices of men shouting for the prisoner to walk. Then moments of silence as they stepped down the stone stairway. Finally, the sounds of the officer leading a firing squad, the shouts of prisoners saying, "Viva Cristo Rey." The sudden volley of rifle fire, then the sudden crack of a pistol being fired point blank into the prisoner's head. A few moments later, the procession made its way back up the stone staircase with the corpse. And finally, the prisoners within the galeras would hear the pine coffin lid being hammered. From across La Cabaña, I spot the statue, a landmark to find Los Portones. We circle back towards the backside of La Cabaña. I finally see the concrete statue still standing over the petroleum slick harbor. We pass under his arm, still frozen 40 years later in the benediction he had given my mother and me and all the families that had walked this road on the way to see their families imprisoned. It is as though I am looking through a bubble, a kind of half-dissolve. The scene as it was 40 years ago, with a line of women and children walking single file towards the Portones and the empty road before me. I remember a curving stone pathway. The road curved down towards La Cabaña, edging Havana Harbor, where below I watched freighters being offloaded.
Yo me acuerdo de esto. Sí.
On the road, I remember pleated skirts and women's hands extending down to hold children, while on either side of us walked the men in green uniforms. All of us, the men in green uniforms, the women, and the children leaned into our steps and down the stone pathway towards the Fort-turned prison. And now ahead of me, I finally see the steel doors that had opened to hell. Why remember the Portones? Perhaps because they're a symbol. Perhaps these doors are etched into my memory because this was my first experience with savagery and violence, with terror and confusion. Perhaps I remember these doors because once through them, my life changed forever. The Portones are chained and padlocked. The place looks abandoned. There are no soldiers or tourists anywhere. There is a low stone wall on either side of the doors, and suddenly I find myself leaping over it. And then I'm behind the metal doors again. Once on the other side of the low coral wall, I can see the path through which my mother and I, and all those other women and children had walked 40 years ago. The immense ceiba tree is still there, shading the path today as it had back then. On the wall of this moat, there is a bronze relief sculpture, a monument carved into the wall where the Spaniards had executed the Mambi. or Cuban rebels, fighting the Spanish for independence. Frozen on the carved bronze, a Spanish firing squad has just begun to execute a line of men who stand, hands tied behind their backs. Some have already fallen. One is still standing. He turns to his executioners defiantly. His shirt is partially open, exposing his heart and chest. Descending out of the sky, appearing directly above the doomed man, an angel. Her mouth, open in an almost audible scream, stretches her hand toward the Spanish firing squad. Her other hand is gently offering protection to the man below her, as though he could take her hand and she would pull him away or kiss it as he died. I follow the path worn into the grass. My mother and I had walked following a Catholic priest through these very stone canyons. The robed priest was leading the women and children to where the next group of prisoners awaited execution. Nearing El Paredón, another crowd of women chanted, "Paredón, paredón," to the wall, to the wall. My mother asked who it was they were executing that day, and someone in the crowd called back, "Los pilotos," the pilots. Inside La Cabaña, Los Pilotos were my two uncles and my father. To the right of the main footbridge that crosses the first of two moats circling the fort, I finally see the wall, El Paredón. Even from where I am, I can see the bullet holes clearly. It is the middle of a hot August day.
¿Por cuál esquinita?
The time when most of the tourists are in air-conditioned restaurants having arroz con pollo.
Ahí hay una escalera, es ahí donde yo le decía.
Sí, aquí mismo, sí, todavía se ve los impactos.
Or poolside at the hotels,
Ahí puede bajar
getting in out of the August heat.
Ah, por esa escalera.
por esa escalera y entonces el otro estaba ahí en la esquina.
En esa esquina.
En la esquina que dice.
Ok. Muchas gracias, muy amable.
La Cabaña feels deserted. The Paredón had, after all, been directly across from the entrance. I have circled back, a rat in a maze, walking in the dry moats. Memory is strange. You remember in detail a soldier standing in the sunlight, the bandolier of ammunition slung across his shoulder, the brass shells glinting in the sunlight, his long black hair flowing over a red and black patch on his shoulder. You remember in exacting detail, only you remember it all wrong. The perspectives are wrong. But still, as you stand there in the sunlight, you're surprised and shocked because that soldier with a bandolier isn't still standing there 40 years later. There is no true number of the prisoners executed for political causes against this wall. Statistics on the executions are a complete secret. The last executions to have taken place here were well into the 80s. I feel like my feet will not touch the ground. Will not, no matter how I push them down onto the grass, crush the green blades. It is like I am suspended above the lawn, like I can't make contact with it. These last few feet have all the quality of a dream. The first to be condemned to die against this wall, and many other paredones around Cuba, were Batista's own military. Many were executed without confirmation or evidence of any real war crimes. In those first bloody days, accusations from anyone loyal to the revolution might bring a prisoner to stand before a firing squad. I can't help but think that here, as in all summary executions, justice was overlooked. The only memorial to the men executed here are the bullet holes, still here after all those years. These coral walls had also been washed in gallons of blood from the revolution's own sons. Like Saturn devouring his own children, men who had fought alongside Fidel had been executed here and against other paredones in Cuba, along with Batistianos and the wrongly accused. I think of the other paredon, around the other side of the fort, where 100 years ago the Spaniards had executed the Mambi. 100 years apart, my grandfather, a Mambi colonel, and my father could have been some of the men executed against the walls of the Spanish fort. The day my mother and I feared never came. In an 11th hour decision, Fidel rescinded his orders to execute the pilots and handed them 20 and 30-year sentences. Instead, they would be sent to a place called the Model Prison on the Isle of Pines, El Presidio. The flight from Havana to what is now called Isla de la Juventud takes maybe 15 minutes. The last time I had taken the trip, as a boy of 7, aboard a ferry from Havana, it had taken 11 hours. The Isle of Youth lies some 50 kilometers south of the mainland. It used to be called the Isle of Pines before the Revolution. Pirates had once used the island as a base from which to attack the Spanish treasure fleets and to bury stolen treasure. Legend has it the Isle of Youth was the model for Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. In 1826, the Spanish established a colony here. For the next 70 years, Isle of Pines became the equivalent of Siberia, a place where prisoners could be shipped, then conveniently forgotten. Construction of the so-called model prison began in 1926 under Cuban President Machado and concluded in 1931. Machado, like the Spanish, chose the Isle of Pines to build the prison because it was close enough to Havana to reach by plane or boat, but far enough away to discourage escape attempts. I stepped past the building where Fidel and the 25 Moncada conspirators had once been jailed. Not part of the main prison, Fidel's cell was housed in the hospital wing, where Batista had even allowed him to run a revolutionary school. Behind the walls of this building, in a room nearly 400 square feet, Fidel's experience of El Presidio would be markedly different from that of his enemies. One of Fidel's letters during the time reads, "I'm going to have dinner, spaghetti with calamari, Italian chocolates for dessert, freshly brewed coffee, and later, an H. Upmann No. 4 cigar. Don't you envy me? When I get some sun in the mornings wearing shorts and feeling the sea breeze, I think that I'm at the beach. They're going to make me think I'm on vacation. What would Karl Marx say of such a revolutionary?" In May of 1955, in a gesture of amnesty, Batista released all political prisoners, including Fidel. A gesture Fidel would deny to every single prisoner who served time here, no matter how long or hellish their sentences. I know in a moment I will go in. I know in a moment I will go in. I stand for a moment outside the brutal walls of this place. The bars on the windows and the doors have long ago been removed, and I know in a moment I will go in, but not until the image of these circular mammoth cages sinks in. As I enter one of the circulares, my gaze is forced up and around, for that is where your eyes are drawn when you enter the putrid belly of one of these monsters. The cells, so tiny they look like windows, blur in my vision. I count 6 floors, 50 cells per floor, though it's hard to be exact because the tiny cells blur together. 2 men to a cell, though my uncle had told me at times as many as 4 prisoners had been packed into these tiny cubicles. There is a tower precisely in the center of the building, like a miniature lighthouse. But where the light should have been, there are slits in the concrete, like malevolent eyes 30 feet off the ground, through which guards randomly sprayed the cells with volleys of machine gun fire. My uncles had described the way the guards had wired the prison to explode during those early Cold War years. Squatting through this underground passageway, I can clearly see numbered holes drilled into the foundation of the prison. There is no mistaking it. These holes are placed directly in the supporting pillars of the entire structure. Sticks of dynamite placed through the base of this building would have blown the entire prison, imploding it, caving the tons of concrete down on top of the thousands of men here. Along either side of the circulares are staircases leading up to the cells. It is early morning and already the temperature is in the 90s. The air is oppressive and humid. My uncle had told me the heat and the stench of 2,000 prisoners was overpowering. I noticed that the marble steps, quarried from the nearby hills by the prisoners themselves, are nearly worn through. On the 6th floor, nearing the wooden roof, the heat is unbearable. The humidity, the heat, and the vertigo make me fight for breath. From here, I can peer 6 floors down to the concrete floor below. I remember my uncle describing how some of the prisoners here would occasionally choose death over a life within these circular walls. Sometimes he would see a blur plummet past the door of a cell and hear a thump and look at the concrete floor below to see the body of another prisoner being carried away, matter-of-factly, by the guards. In Hollywood, a producer had given me a book called Contra toda esperanza, Against All Hope, to read for a proposed screenplay. It was Armando Valladares' book on life in political prisons in Cuba. I was Cuban, and Hollywood logic, I would be perfect to write the screenplay based on the book. In the book, I had read the story of one of the prisoners who had needed an infected molar pulled. This prisoner begged the guards that he be taken to the infirmary. The guards ignored him. Days later, sick with pain and fever, the man finally called to any of the adjoining cells if anyone could help, if there were any dentists within earshot, if anyone knew what to do. Finally, this prisoner heard a voice in the next cell tell him that he wasn't a dentist, but that he did have a pair of pliers he had fashioned from 2 spoons. It was only after I interviewed my 2 uncles that I learned the story about the man with the molar was my Uncle Luis. I sat with both my uncles and listened as they spoke in quiet, almost forgiving tones about the 23 years of food with maggots, the forced work in the cane fields, about guards with bayonets standing naked in the showers with prisoners. I learned that the water in the showers would run pink with blood as the guards stabbed the prisoners if they took too long. I step into one cell and stand looking out from the claustrophobic space. Through the open window, where once a prisoner would have gazed, I see, brilliantly framed in the tropical sun, a single huge royal palm. Standing in this cell, I wonder if my uncles had stared at that very palm, gazing at it for 20 years, unable to sit beneath its shade. My Uncle Luis had told me the greatest irony of his life was that as a young pilot, when he had Fidel handcuffed to the open door of his troop transport, when he had thought about simply inverting the plane, letting Fidel drop out of that open door at 10,000 feet, he had not. Of course, it was not in him to do. But the 23 years he spent in El Presidio, perhaps staring at that royal palm, had given him plenty of time to reconsider his decision. Standing in this prison knits me to my family, to a past that I rejected and to an island that I nearly forgot. Standing here lost in this huge expanse of concrete doesn't have the effect of making me feel smaller. It makes me feel larger. In those 42 years, Fidel Castro has imprisoned tens of thousands of his opponents, armed, unarmed, peaceful, or revolutionary. My story and my family's story has been repeated over 4 decades. Thousands upon thousands of times. La Cabaña, El Presidio Modelo, and El Paredón are abandoned, prisons no longer. But there are other political prisons dotting the island, and other political prisoners looking through other barred windows, and other children standing in line, waiting to visit their fathers and their uncles. I can give language now to that wordless place inside of me that I'd always wanted to return, to feel what I could not feel as a child, understand what could not be understood at that age, to finally shudder at the separation, to grieve the loss, and weep.